Good evening and welcome to this forum on the implications of the Stage 3 tax cuts, brought to you by the Tax Law and Policy Research Program at the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law and also the Melbourne Social Equity Institute. My name is Peter Mayers and I'll be facilitating this evening's discussion, including your questions to our great lineup of expert speakers. This is a hybrid event, both online and in person. But whether we are here at the Melbourne Law School or joining online from somewhere else in Australia, we are all on the country of Australia's First Nations peoples on lands that were never ceded. The University of Melbourne is located on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and recognise their enduring custodianship of and care for this country. And I extend that recognition to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples throughout Australia, and especially any who are joining us at this forum. And with this acknowledgement, I echo the aspiration of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, that this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australian nationhood. And I hope that as a first step, we'll soon have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice enshrined in the Constitution. Our format this evening between now and 7:30 is as follows. We'll have 5 short presentations from our expert speakers, including with ACOS CEO Cassandra Goldie, who'll provide us with the view from the community and welfare sector. And that will be followed by a panel discussion when, as I say, you'll have a chance to ask questions or put views. So to get us underway and to frame our discussions, I'd like to invite Professor Joe Barakat, the Director of the Melbourne Social Equity Institute, to make a few opening remarks. Joe.
Thank you. And I won't take too long because I'm not the main game, but was kindly invited to make a few comments on behalf of Melbourne Social Equity Institute, which is funding the community tax project that forms part of to this evening's event. Melbourne Social Equity Institute is one of 4 interdisciplinary research institutes at the University of Melbourne. We're kindly hosted by the law school, but we're a product of Chancellery, and our job is to work across the divisions and silos, both within the university and from the university into the world, with a particular focus on creating fairer societies through research that makes the difference. That's our core focus. The primary DNA of the Institute, beyond the breadth of projects and activities that we're involved in, is our commitment to community engaged and co-productive research activity, recognising that we need to do more to acknowledge the diverse expertise, experience and capabilities that sit across all sectors and indeed in community, and bringing those to the fore in the kinds of research endeavours that we're involved in. When I became the director of Melbourne Social Equity Institute was just the beginning of last year, and it was an ideal time because we were also coming out of lockdown to bring the group together and have another look at our current research settings and research priorities. And one of the new research priorities we determined we needed to address in this complex collection of challenges facing us in relation to COVID, climate, and cost of living was distributive and inclusive economies. And we were really delighted when Catherine and team put up a project around the community tax project, because I can't think of anything that's more distributive and has a greater effect on both exclusion and potential inclusion than our tax system alongside our social services systems. So we're really pleased to be a very small part of supporting tonight's event, and I will now move on and let you hear from the real speakers.
Thanks very much, Joe. And this is a really timely discussion, not least because we're not, long away from a budget and expecting and to see what will be in that budget. In fact, I heard Jim Chalmers on ABC Radio National this morning saying in relation to the budget that there are more good ideas than the capacity to fund them. And that goes to the heart of our discussions this evening. I think the need to boost government revenue if we are going to provide the type of public services and supports that citizens want and need, not to mention new submarines. But I hope we'll also get to another aspect of this discussion, which is not just about revenue raised or foregone and what can be done with that in terms of public services and the like, but also about the pernicious impacts of inequality itself and the role that tax can play in reducing gaps in wealth and incomes, quite apart from what tax can do in terms of government spending. So our first two speakers this evening are from the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research, and they're going to help us understand how the landscape in which these stage 3 tax cuts will ultimately land, the broader economic landscape, particularly when it comes to questions of distribution, of poverty, of inequality, and of welfare. So our first speaker is economist Dr. Guion Kalb, who's a professorial fellow in the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research here at the University of Melbourne, and has many and vast research interests, including labour supply interests, labour supply issues, especially female labour supply and its interaction with things like social security, taxation, family policies, and so on. And Guion is going to speak to us about poverty in Australia. So Guion, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I aim to make a case against continuing with the stage 3 income tax cuts, which would mostly benefit mid to higher income households. In my presentation, I will not really talk much about what these tax 3 tax cuts involve. That will sort of be explained in detail later. So I will just talk about the broader context. And so providing tax relief for one group really means that something else has to go. So if you provide support to one group, you need to balance that by providing less support to other groups. There's an opportunity cost of providing these tax cuts. And that's sort of a really important concern in economics, where we look at the scarcity of resources and looking at how you can best distribute these resources amongst the population. And so the scarcity of resources is really central here. So if we sort of decide to have less revenue because we are going to introduce this stage 3 tax cut, that means something else has to give. And so in this presentation, I want to show who may miss out on sort of getting support as a result of committing to the stage 3 tax cut. And would like to argue that allocating money differently would improve fairness and could be an investment leading to better economic outcomes overall. And given the increasing cost of living, which disproportionately affects lower income households, this is particularly important right now. First, before sort of talking about other things, for context, would like to show the poverty rates using two different poverty lines. The Henderson poverty line, which is done from the Melbourne Institute, and the 50% of medium income poverty line, which is also called the OECD 50. What I want to show is this sort of the general patterns of poverty over the past few years up to 2014, and just show that the poverty lines that we're using are relatively conservative. So most of the talk today, I will be using the Henderson poverty line, and basically that lies around the same values as the poverty line using the 50% of the median. So no matter which poverty line we use, we find a slightly declining rate of poverty, but a substantial proportion of the population remains in poverty. So when we use this measure, we find that at the end of the observation period in this graph, which is 2014, we have about 10% of the population in poverty. And so I will get back to the decline in poverty in a few slides. But before I do that, I just want to show some more graphs. I'm an economist, I like numbers, I like showing sort of patterns. And the graphs that are on the screen right now show that people on income support are basically by definition in poverty. So if I use the Henderson poverty line, then I can sort of look at what the income support is relative to this poverty line. So the horizontal dashed line that you see around value 1 is the rate where the income support would be exactly the same as the poverty line. So being below this line is not a good thing. Being below this line means you're in poverty. So you can see at all these graphs, people on income support are basically in poverty, except perhaps the couple families on the pension. They seem to be hovering more or less around the poverty line. But especially people on allowances, they are sort of way below. And from 2000 to 2014, that was declining. So we saw a sort of pattern where every year people were sort of slightly sliding further back from the poverty line. And so this is basically the same pattern for people with children. And so we have two graphs with the couple families and single parent families. And so these are data from 2000 to 2014. So I thought it would be interesting to update this with some more recent data. And I've chosen the month of June in 2020. The reason for that is that was just after they introduced the job seeker allowance to replace temporarily the New Start allowance. And basically what it meant was that people on an allowance nearly got twice as much income support as they did before. So that's a huge change. When you do that, you can see that the ratio of income support to the poverty line increases dramatically. So for example, when we look at couple families, the ratio becomes 1.5 instead of 0.8. So that's a real improvement in, and no, so that's in the words, it's not, sorry, I didn't update the graphs. The graphs are just going to 2014. So what I'm talking about now is on the left-hand side. And so that was a major improvement for these families. And then looked at the most recent months that I have currently available, which is September 2022, do the same calculations. And basically what I find is that we are at the same level as we were at the end of 2014. And so I guess the slightly good news is that we didn't decrease further. So the pattern of further decrease hasn't sort of continued, because they did increase after the COVID crisis. They did increase the job seeker to some extent. So they sort of returned not completely to the old levels, but basically it was just enough to keep at the same level as 2014. And so that sort of really has big consequences for people on income support. They're basically all in poverty. So when we look at who is in poverty, and I'm taking some of the data that we had for 2014, where we had about 10.1% in poverty overall, then women are slightly more likely to be in poverty, but that's sort of hiding a little bit some of the impacts for women who are more likely to be amongst the people who are over 65, who are more likely to be in poverty. They're also more likely to be a single person. They're more likely to be a single parent. Both groups are sort of more likely to be in poverty. Not surprisingly, given what I just showed about the income support, people who are unemployed or out of the labor force are more likely to be in poverty. When we look at education levels, people with lower education are more likely to be in poverty. And I had a look at tenants in social housing. Not surprisingly, they are more likely to be in poverty as well. So just coming back to the declining poverty rate from 3 slides ago, we did investigate where this decrease came from. So what was causing the decrease from 2000 to 2014. And we find that 63% of this decrease was due to wages and salaries increasing, and 26% to public transfers. And so that's all I want to show with this table. So there's no, we'll need to read all the details, but I just want to show that there's some calculations behind what I'm stating here. And this is really important when we're sort of thinking forward. So keeping in mind sort of the importance of employment and income support that was sort of shown in the previous slide, to reduce poverty, we could use the funding and revenue that we save from not introducing the stage 3 tax cuts to raise, for example, income support. It seems like a very logical thing to do, but also to assist people in obtaining employment by introducing employment programs. And so if we would do that, then the expected impacts from not continuing with the stage 3 tax cuts would be that for low-income households, there are potentially really large positive impacts. Because COVID-19, for example, showed that this really made a very big difference to the lives of people on income support. They were able to afford rent and other essentials, and it drastically reduced financial stress for these families. If we can set up good employment programs, perhaps combined with earned income tax credits, so that moving into employment really pays for people on relatively low wages. If we can provide additional social housing to combat homelessness and insecure housing, which would sort of help to reduce the impacts of poverty, but also give people a good basis to start perhaps returning to education or starting to enter the labor force again. And of course, we shouldn't forget the next generation, high quality childcare for all children, high quality and inclusive education from a young age are really important to ensure that the next generation has the opportunities to succeed in life. And then when we look at the people who are sort of suffering, if we would sort of not introduce the stage 3 tax cuts, those are sort of the medium to higher level income households, that would be expected to be quite limited. So they would not receive the additional, I guess, disposable income that they are expecting, but relative terms, speaking in relative terms, that's a relatively small amount. And when we think of sort of broader society, so some people might argue that will sort of provide disincentives to work for these groups of people. I think studies really show that that doesn't really play out that way. So when we change the work incentives at higher income ranges, that has very limited impact on the labor supply decisions of those groups. And so there would not be sort of these flow-on effects that some people might sort of anticipate or argue that would sort of disadvantage, I guess, society more broadly. And I guess that's what I wanted to feedback. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That was really interesting. I was struck by the 45%, I think it was, of the tenants in social housing being likely to be in poverty, which reflects, as someone who's very interested in housing, a couple of things. One, the triaging of our social housing so that it goes to the people most in need now. So increasingly you concentrate disadvantage in social housing. But also it'd be very interesting to look at the rates of poverty if you did an analysis after housing costs are deducted. Because of course their housing costs, if you're in social housing, you're paying a limited amount of your income on housing, whereas people who are in the private rental market may be paying 50% or more of their income on housing. If you're in social housing, it'll be less than 30%. So overall, you might still be better off. Anyway, really interesting. Thank you very much. And our second speaker is Professor Roger Wilkins. He's Deputy Director of the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research, and also Deputy Director Research of the HILDA Survey Program area. And many of you will be familiar with HILDA and the amazing data it produces. So he's very interested in questions of distribution and the dynamics of economic well-being, the incidence and determinants of poverty, social exclusion, welfare dependence, and so on. And Roger's going to speak about income distribution, income inequality, and so on. So Roger, over to you.
Yeah, so as Peter said, while Guillaume was sort of very much focused at the disadvantaged end of the spectrum, I thought I'd provide a bit more of an overall picture of where we're at in terms of income inequality, its levels, its trends, the current and trends in the impact of the government income taxes and cash transfers on inequality. And then I thought I'd just try to briefly give some indications of the effects, the likely effects of the stage 3 tax cuts on overall inequality. All right, so the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that there's a result that people still seem to find quite surprising, that as conventionally measured, income inequality hasn't really been trending up or down, at least over the last couple of decades. So this is the Gini coefficient. It's sourced from the HILDA survey. And it goes up, it goes down. You can see there that particularly in COVID, it dropped sharply because of all of the measures such as what Guillaume was talking about, the coronavirus supplement for allowance recipients. But it hasn't overall been really sort of moving that much. Now, having said that, we know that household surveys don't do a great job of getting incomes at the very top. The very, very rich, they have a big impact on the distribution, and they are just harder to catch in household surveys. So researchers have turned to income tax data to try to get a better sense of what's going on at the very top. And it does turn out that when you look at our tax data, this is the share of income going to the top 1% of the population. That has been trending upwards over time, and including over the period that I showed you in the previous slide. So there is, on this dimension, some rise in inequality. The other thing to mention here, though, is that also that the tax data is not going to get us all the way there where we want to be. So you have problems that it only captures what gets reported to the tax office. So people who are avoiding or minimising tax will cause you to underestimate incomes, and we think that's probably more prevalent amongst very high earners. Trusts are difficult to deal with in terms of who the beneficial owners of the trust are and how to attribute that income. And also, perhaps most importantly, capital gains is not in there. Now, it's not in the household survey data either. Now, you can actually, in the tax data, get a measure of what we call realised taxable capital gains. So this is when you sell an asset or realise a capital gain on an asset that's taxable, so not your home, then that precipitates a tax liability, and that shows up in the data. But but that's very lumpy, and people who never sell, they don't realise the capital gain, and we don't observe it. So it's including it's almost more distortionary than to not include it. What is an open question, though, is with all of these deficiencies, sure, they affect the level of this line, but do they affect the slope? And you can make arguments in both directions that the capture of tax data is either improved or deteriorated, which is there's arguments for both. So here I'm looking at the effects of income taxes and government cash transfers on this measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient. So the way to think about this is going from people's market incomes before they get any government benefits and before they pay any income taxes, going from that distribution to the distribution of income once transfers have been received and income taxes paid. This measure of the Gini coefficient decreases by the amount given on the axis. So the higher this is, the more redistribution the government is doing. Now, it's not saying this is not quite the same as the effect of government on inequality, because people's behaviour is likely to get affected by the tax and transfer system. So it's not quite the same as the effects on inequality, but it's showing you that in going from people's private income, market incomes to their post-government incomes, this is how much inequality gets reduced. And you can see that that's over the last 20 years trended downwards. But interestingly, that's more driven by the income support system than by the tax system. So there is some slight decline in the extent to which income taxes are redistributing income over this period. But most of the action actually is in a reduced role for the income support system, which actually has two sides to it, the positive side and the negative side. So the positive side is that we've had employment growth, particularly amongst low-income households, and so they've had less need for the income support system, and that's been the good side. On the bad side, we've seen that government's really turning the screws in terms of the austerity level of payments, putting more and more people on the low unemployment benefit, people with disability, people with single people with children. And then we've also I've forgotten actually what I was going to say there about turning the screws. Cass will be able to fill it in, I'm sure, but that's sort of the dark side of what's been driving that down. So as for the effects of the stage 3 tax cuts, well, it's actually not that, it wouldn't be that hard to do an exercise where we just apply that tax code to our existing income distribution, and then see what falls out in terms of basically what happens to this line going forward. But it's actually a bit of work, and so I haven't actually done that exercise yet. So instead, what I've just done is just provide some suggestive or indicative indications of what's likely to result from these tax cuts. So this is here basically showing the blue line is at the current tax rate. So this is the stage 2 as a result of the stage 2 tax cuts. What proportion of your income is paid in tax? So as you'd expect in a progressive income tax system, it slopes upwards. The higher your income, the higher the share of it goes in tax. So it when you get up to about $300,000, you're paying about 37% of your income in tax. What I've got there is the orange line is what the average tax rates look like by income level when after the cuts. And the striking thing there is that now that median, that's a very approximate line. I haven't sort of taken too much care in positioning it exactly, but you can see that the majority of people, they have no effect on the tax that they pay. Everyone to the left of that vertical blue line. So the benefits are very much going to higher income earners, as this obvious from just looking at what the proposed changes are. And they peak at around the 200,000 level. That's where the people who are getting the biggest cut in the share of their income going in tax. Now, the criticism that you might get that I want to anticipate here is, what's the right, what you might call counterfactual, what we should be comparing with. And a lot of people will refer to the effects of bracket creep. Now, bracket creep, there's two broad definitions floating around there. One is that it's just the effects of inflation. So as prices go up, everyone starts moving to the right on this, and so the proportion of your income that's subject to higher tax rates increases over time, even though your real income, the goods and services you can buy with that income, hasn't increased. So that's what people are thinking of when they talk about bracket creep. So it's not just about moving into the top tax bracket, it's all the way through. A higher proportion of your income is in each of the higher tax brackets. Another definition that I probably makes a bit more sense is to define bracket creep as the increase in average tax that occurs because of nominal income growth. But what I've done instead is just looked at the simpler version and said, well, what if we just indexed the current tax thresholds for inflation between June 2020, just when the stage 2 tax cuts came in, and then a forecast of where the price level will be by the time the stage 3 tax cuts are introduced. So I've used the RBA forecast for inflation. So this light blue line is what you would get for the average tax rate if you were to index these thresholds. And so as you expected, the average tax rate would decrease at each nominal income level. But what you see there is that high income people above about 130,000, they're doing better than that, accounting for bracket creep. And people at lower incomes, they're doing worse. So it's doing, we're doing nothing at the low end. Sure. And so people might say, but you're only indexing from 2020. We've got to go back. You've got to go back further to account for the bracket creep that's occurred from a longer period. So, for example, if you just go back to 2012-13, you get the green line. Now, so what we're doing here is I'm using the rates and thresholds that applied in 2012-13 and then just indexing them for inflation up to 2024. And you get the same sort of qualitative result that, that we would be doing a lot more for low-income people by doing that indexation, and we'd be doing less than what the stage 3 tax cuts are doing. So if you hear that argument that it's just a way of giving back bracket creep a little bit, but it's doing quite a bit more than that for high income earners. Okay, so I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. Fact that you're concerned about bracket creep, there's another way to address the problem than the statutory tax cut. So yeah, really terrific. Thank you for that. And another question we might come back with, because we're talking about income inequality, and then we don't have to wealth inequality. That's a really whole other field, that one that is also having to talk about. So our next two speakers, Dr. Catherine James and Professor Miranda Stewart, are both from the Melbourne Law School, and they're the driving forces behind this community tax project that gave rise to our forum. Catherine's going to speak first. She teaches and researches in taxation law and policy, particularly interested in how apparently technical questions, perhaps like we've just been discussing, apparently technical questions of taxation actually have an effect on distribution and economic justice. So Catherine's going to put these pending stage 3 tax cuts in the context of debates about different forms and rates of taxation. Catherine.
Thanks so much, Peter. And I'm not an economist, so I don't have slides, but hopefully I can maintain your interest by the power of my ideas. And Miranda and I are doing a bit of a double act today. So I'm going to provide a general theoretical framework for the stage 3 tax cuts debate. And Miranda will speak specifically to what the tax cuts are and their likely impact. And my role as an academic is to show the way that theory can inform practice. And so my role tonight is to show how this narrow discussion about the merits or otherwise of the stage 3 income tax cuts relate to the broader issue of the role of a progressive income tax in securing economic justice. And by economic justice, I broadly mean our individual and collective ability to have access to the means to live a good life. Now, the use of the progressive income tax as a mass revenue raising tool is a unique feature of a select group of wealthy nations, including Australia, which primarily occurred and certainly peaked in the 20th century. And as economists like Thomas Piketty have shown, this coincides with a golden age of both increasing social product and declining inequality. Now, there are two components of a progressive income tax. One is the rates, which is obviously the debate we're having tonight and the issue that the stage 3 tax cuts give rise to. And we can have progressive rates, meaning the rich pay more. We can have proportional rates, meaning we pay the same irrespective of income. Or we can have regressive rates, meaning the poor pay more relative to the rich. But it also involves the issue of the base, which in the case of an income tax mainly relates to whether or not we tax income from labour and how we tax income from capital. And so I'll speak to each of these two components in turn. Now, on the rates side, a progressive rate structure for the income tax was traditionally justified by two complementing principles: the ability to pay principle and the benefit principle. So the ability to pay principle was that the greater ability you had to contribute to the collective good, the more you should pay. The benefit principle was that the greater the benefit that you derive from the infrastructure of the state, which in the context of the rich tends to be things like the protection of private property rights and the securing of stable capital markets, then the greater price you pay for the civilization you find yourself in. Now, in most countries like Australia, the height of the progressive income tax rate structure peaked roughly after the Second World War. So, for example, in the 1950 to 51 income year, there were 28 individual income tax brackets with a top marginal rate of 75%. Which kicked in at £10,000 of annual income, which was roughly about 33 times the average wage of a male factory worker. Now, since the 1980s, Australia and many other similarly developed economies have moved to compress and reduce marginal income tax rates. So today in Australia, we have 5 brackets with a top rate of 47%, including the Medicare levy. And this kicks in at an annual income of just over $180,000 a year, which is about twice average male full-time earnings. Now, in terms of the economic impact of these changes, they might not be too dramatic if at the same time as you're compressing and cutting tax rates, you're expanding the base, which is what we did initially in Australia in the early to mid 1980s when we introduced a capital gains and fringe benefits tax. But on the issue of the base, the economic consensus of the desirability of taxing income on a broad base has also shifted. So whereas it was once the case that, at least in theory, economists, certainly not lawyers, but economists sought to tax income from a broad base because they thought it was the most efficient and fair measure of your economic capacity. So you pay the same rate of tax whether or not you derive your income from selling assets through or increasing the value of your assets, or rent from real estate, or dividends from shares. You pay the same amount of tax as you do if you have to sell your labour in exchange for a wage. However, the theoretical consensus on progressive rates and a broad base of economic income shifted from about the late 1970s to the early 1980s towards one which reduced and compressed income tax rates and which moved away from taxing capital and income from capital on the basis that this would be better for economic growth because it was least distortive to market decisions, and later because of the increased difficulty of taxing highly mobile capital and capital income. And just as the commitment to both components of a progressive income tax have declined, so too has inequality risen. And this is the case in most rich democracies which have chosen the same path, but with localised variations. The US, Australia, and even in our fated Scandinavian social welfare democracies. And so, for example, in the context of the US, Emmanuel Sayers and Gabriel Zuckman have identified that the US tax system now is roughly proportionate, meaning that most income groups pay the same rate of tax, which is roughly a third of their income, but then regressive at the very top, with the very rich barely paying 20% of their income. And so this leads to the kind of famous situation of Warren Buffett paying less tax than his secretary. So this might cause some people to ask, well, why should we care? Because I think there is a type of thinking which we see picked up in policy documents like the Henry Review, for example, which provides that provided you raise enough revenue to fund essential social services and to support the poor with transfer payments, then who cares if you do so through an economically efficient but regressive tax, like, for example, the GST. And tax clearly has an important instrumental role to play in society because it's the main way we raise revenue to fund the state, even if we might disagree on the appropriate size and scope of the state. And as many in this room would know, Australia is a low tax and low spending state by comparison to similarly wealthy countries. But this is a choice. And COVID-19 showed us that a bunch of essential services which we thought were previously unobtainable were in fact very achievable if we made different choices, be it funding universal access to childcare or housing the homeless. So as Ken Henry recently suggested, there is a discussion to be had about our overall level of taxation and spending, particularly if we want to provide important social goods like health and education, which coincidentally are also conducive to economic growth. But if tax was purely about raising revenue in the most economically efficient manner, then as the Nobel Prize-winning economists and optimal tax theorists Peter Diamond and Jim Merlees famously demonstrated, the solution is pretty straightforward. You simply levy a poll tax or a head tax consisting of a single uniform lump sum payment which everyone has to pay. Because it's unable to be avoided, it's non-distorting and very efficient. However, as Margaret Thatcher famously realised 3 decades ago, because such a tax is unfair, because it imposes the same burden on the billionaire and the pauper, no system explicitly adopts it. And the riots which occasioned Thatcher's tax proposal suggest that tax is not just about raising revenue in the most economically efficient manner, it involves fairness in the distribution of the tax burden. And this is especially the case when so many other aspects of the market and its regulation are geared towards facilitating economic growth. And the American political philosopher John Rawls reminds us that addressing inequality is not just about lifting the bottom up, but it's about ensuring a fair equality of opportunity for all, which also requires attention to the top, so that the happy or unhappy circumstances of one's birth does not predetermine their access to fully enjoy the civic and political participation in a democracy. So yes, it's important that everyone can have access to good health and a decent education, regardless of the lottery of life's draw. But equally, it's important that your ability to run for public office or secure desirable social roles does not primarily depend on the fortune that you and your family have amassed or on your social connections. Now, in other contexts, we're pretty comfortable with this idea. So I'd note that I'm speaking in Melbourne or Naarm on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation, and I too pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I note the importance of footy or Marngrook to our civic life here. And as most of us know, or maybe not most of us, I know, this AFL salary cap places a limit on how much clubs can spend on their players in their list. Without it, the competition would be pretty dull because it'd be dominated by the wealthy clubs like our nearest neighbour, the Carlton Blues, and unlike my beloved Western or Footscray Bulldogs, and even admittedly the Gold Coast Suns. And the same philosophy applies to our tax system. It's not just about making sure we have enough money to run a thriving competition and fund grassroots footy, but it's also about levelling the playing field so that your sporting prowess or achievements are not simply a product of the resources you can amass. Players and staff can still make a mozza, but it's not a complete free-for-all. And we choose these rules in our shared interests for the good of the game. So I'll now turn to Miranda, who will speak to the specific issue of the stage 3 tax cuts, but remind you that this is just the first of a broader discussion we should have about not just the rates, but the base. Thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. And I'm so glad you mentioned John Rawls and the connection with AFL. Who knew that the AFL Commission was a Rawlsian institution? And it's not just, of course, the salary cap, it's also the draft pick. So the bottom team always gets the first draft pick. That is a Rawlsian solution to evening up the system. So yeah, 3 cheers for John Rawls and his influence on Australian football. So Professor Miranda Stewart, Director of the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law and Taxation Studies here at the Law School, and Honorary Professor also in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. And for those of you who don't know, Miranda's latest book is called Tax and Government in the 21st Century. So she's absolutely the right person to address the specifics of the stage 3 tax cuts. Miranda.
Thank you. Well, Catherine both did the profound remarks, I think, in this panel and the most socially relevant ones about football. So look, my task, you might think could have been at the beginning of this session, but I think it's kind of interesting to give you this bit of information at the end, or to actually not the end, because we will have Cassandra giving a really important view at the end before we go into discussion. But I thought it would be useful to remind us, you probably think you know, or many of you may know what the stage 3 tax cuts are, but actually to remind you exactly what they are, like what do we mean by that in specifics, and that might feed into how we think about how they might be different or why they might be different if pose that. So this is a chart that could have also had Roger's curved lines put onto it. And in fact, I didn't do that, but one could, and possibly I should have, because that would have connected our two things a little better. So what this shows is the tax rate structure as it was in 2017-18, when we first had the legislation that enacted all 3 stages, 1, 2, and 3 of this tax cuts. So the first thing to remember, again, most people probably know this, is that these have already been legislated. They have been sitting in the law since 2018 with some modifications due to COVID that actually increased the cut in some respects. So if one was to change them, that actually requires us to reverse legislation. It's not about should they be enacted or not. They are already there in the law. So the grey line shows our stepped rate structure in 24-25, which is when the tax cut will, the last stage of this tax cut will take effect. Now, these lines actually also build into them the 2% Medicare levy, which sits on top of the normal tax rate structure and is 2%. The Medicare levy flattens the rate structure already because it's calculated on your total taxable income. So it's actually a proportionate tax, the way that Catherine described it. Everybody pays, more or less everybody pays 2% Medicare levy. We actually already have that in our system on top of the total, and then the marginal rate for your income. So we have a zero bracket of close to 20,000. Our next rate structure is 19% with the Medicare levy 21. The next one currently is 32.5% plus Medicare levy 37%, and then 45% plus the Medicare levy. So we talk about the top rate as being 47. Of course, that's taxable income. So what Roger was explaining was what we call, so these are what we call marginal rates, right? The rate on your next dollar of income. What Roger was explaining is what we call the average tax rate, which is the tax that you pay as a share of your taxable income, and that's a curve. So if we were to superimpose Roger's lines on my chart, we would get that curve happening on the chart there. And it would be increasing because as we base on the ability to pay, and as your income, taxable income increases, we levy a higher rate. Now, if you've got 3 million of taxable income, you're basically paying 47%. But you know, right. But so let me just say a bit more about what specifically this stage 3 tax cut is going to do, and then I'll put it in the context of where it came from and a couple of other comments, and I'll come back to some of those policy and design issues. So what the stage 3 cut will do is it will remove the 37% rate entirely. It lowers the 32.5% rate to 30%, and it increases the threshold for the top rate from 180,000 of taxable income to 200,000. It's those three things together is what we call stage 3. And you can see that it has the effect of, as Catherine nicely puts it, compressing further and flattening further the rate structure. So if one was to, not to go ahead with them, one could remove all 3 elements, right, and just not do the stage 3 tax cut, or one could potentially choose one of these and not do it. There might be reasons for leaving the others, or one could come up with a different sort of structure altogether, or, for example, index the thresholds to inflation or something, which Roger showed you would have an effect which is similar but not the same as the stage 3 tax cut. Okay, so the second question to think about is who benefits from it, and you've already heard from Roger properly that obviously those with above median incomes, so median being the centre of the income distribution, those with above median incomes benefit. So just a little bit more information about that. I think it's useful to do a gender analysis. Now, men earn more income than women in general, and there are many more men in the top 1%, top 10% of the income distribution. So I just thought it's useful to point out the averages there. The consequence is logical, which is that women benefit less from the stage 3 tax cut, right? The lower your income. The individuals who are in the top tax bracket, so earning 180,000 or more than 180,000 taxable income, it's a pretty small percentage of the total, only 4% of total taxpayer population. They do pay quite a lot of income tax, but they have a very substantial capacity to pay. They're up the top there, so they will get the full benefit of the tax cut, which is what Roger's charts showed. And then I think it's kind of useful to to add a couple more pieces of data to the story. And this sort of explains partly how we connect this to what we think of as the fiscal cost of these tax cuts. Every year, what's the revenue that we lose? And Guillaume said, well, if we're keeping the envelope the same, if we're going to lose that revenue, what's going to happen with our expenditure or other benefits that we're providing? So 42% of taxpayers are in the kind of 40 to 80,000 range. That's the median income and sort of average income range. And they pay about 1/3 of total tax. And then there's about 17% of taxpayers in the range from sort of 90,000 to 180,000 in the middle there. You might think of that as upper middle income earners. And they pay about 37% of total tax. So I guess the point is that if we were to change any one of these different elements of the stage 3 tax cut, although the top threshold looks like it's the one that hits the high income earners, therefore the top threshold's the bit we should be concerned about, actually it's the bits in the middle, the 37% rate and the lowering of the 32.5% to 30% rate, those two elements which are going to hit a large number of taxpayers and have the greatest fiscal cost as a result, right? So if we were to wind these back, for example, you might think, well, maybe should we change the top threshold bit? That's the rich. But actually, the biggest impact would be if we change the other elements. That's an important thing to keep in mind if you think, how might we respond to this? Okay, so just to put it briefly in context, stage 1, people might recall the low and middle income tax offset, or LAMITO, as it was lovingly called, comes to an end on the 30th of June this year. And so that was delivered to the bottom and the middle. Stage 2, the thresholds were increased for those middle income rates. LAMITO was supposed to be abolished after only 1 year, but here we have politics intervening, number 1, and then COVID intervening, number 2. So the first thing is, some of you will remember a few years ago, LAMITO was supposed to be withdrawn. There was a political kerfuffle. People said, oh, you can't take away what you've just given, a tax cut for low and middle income earners. You've got to keep it there. So it was kept for another year temporarily. Then COVID arrives. We have to deliver income support and tax cuts more broadly. So LAMITO gets extended again. So now we are in a situation where some of you will have seen this news in the newspapers, you know, so LAMITO comes to an end. That's the tax cut that was delivered to the bottom of the distribution and the middle. That comes to an end, and now we're going to shift our tax cuts to the top of the distribution. Yeah. So the newspapers are running with, well, this is a tax increase. We're actually increasing tax for those at the bottom. And we find the very odd position where a legislated tax change that was the previous government's change is being defended by the treasurer of a new government who now somehow is put in a position where it looks like he's increasing taxes on the bottom, even though within the system was not the original intention. So it's a very kind of complicated mess, I think. So I'm going to stop there. I want to highlight just 3 things here, but way we can come to them in discussion, I think, looking at our chair. The first thing is fiscal cost, and just the Parliamentary Budget Office's estimate of the total fiscal cost of the stage 3 tax cut is in the current year about 20 billion a year. And that increases, and the reason it increases is because of bracket creep. The more people move into the high earners, the more likely it is, the more fiscal cost we have. So 20 billion a year is kind of, you could think of as what we're playing with. And we could talk more about that in a minute. The second is bracket creep. So I think Roger's done a good job of sort of explaining the bracket creep point. One of the things I wanted to emphasize is that the whole idea that you have bracket creep depends on wages being increased to inflation, because it's your wage that is taxed, of course. If wages are not keeping pace with inflation, in fact, bracket creep is not happening in the first, people are still facing cost of living pressures, of course. And the third is just to emphasize that what we're seeing is a redistribution of the tax burden from the top to the middle and lower. right? So that's what happens when we flatten the structure. I'll leave it there, Peter, and we can come back to a couple of the other things.
Thanks very much, Miranda. And I think you summed it up with it's a complex mess. And I think that says a lot about our tax system. So our final speaker, our closing speaker will be known to you all. Dr. Cassandra Goldie is the CEO of ACOS, Australian Council of Social Service, of course, the Peak Council for Community Services nationally. And that organisation and Cassandra as its CEO are fierce advocates for people affected by poverty, disadvantage and inequality. So we will be then, after Cassandra speaks, we'll be going to questions, including from our colleagues who are joining us online. Feel free to put your questions in the chat and they'll be relayed to me. And here in the audience, if you've got questions, before you forget them, jot them down, put them on, not on your phone, whatever, because we'll be looking for your questions when we go to the panel discussion after Cassandra. But welcome, Cassandra.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you very much. Just checking the mic is working. So look, good evening. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. I just want to acknowledge I'm particularly grateful for being on the Wurundjeri people's land this evening and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to say how thrilled I am about the Community Tax Project. It's such an important initiative and it takes a lot to get this going. And so I really want to thank all of you for making this happen because it is absolutely the debate that we need. I want to say it's so great to see you here, Jamie, who is representing Penny Dorsch, who leads our Poverty and Equality Partnership work. There's a connection there. It's so great to see you and my beautiful friend, Micheline Lee, and a number of other of you here. I want to say I love the fact that you have all, including those of you online, chosen to be here talking about tax on a Tuesday evening and how many of the mixed genders we are in the room, because this is often captured by a very particular look and feel in our country. And that is why we're in the mess, frankly, that we are right now. So I think it's time for us to take control of this debate and get a different outcome. I'm really, of course, going to highlight some of the issues that are about fairness, that it is about outcomes, and is about why tax really matters. It matters to me. I grew up in a household, my dad was a tax man. I grew up in a household where culturally we were taught it was your obligation to pay your fair share of tax. And I've come to understand it as actually was one of our greatest acts of love. And I don't say that to be cute. I think it's actually really real. It's a great act of love to give up, because you know that somebody else over there can turn up to a public hospital and get the care that they need, including me on Sunday night when I jammed my finger in a car door very late and I turned up to the public health system and it worked. It's there for people when you lose your job. You won't ever meet that person, but you can know that somebody is actually able to feed themselves and to keep a roof over their head at a time when they need the help the most. So it really is, for me, the perfect circle of what it means to have unconditional love as a society. These tax cuts are absolutely bad policy. They always were, both in terms of design, in terms of fairness, and most acutely for us in this view now, given the country we are and where we are at in terms of the price that we will pay if these tax cuts go ahead. The budget is in structural deficit. 2 years of pandemic, repeated disasters, increasing economic instability and high inflation are driving a devastating cost of experience for people on very low incomes and modest incomes out there in Australian society. And I know that some of you are in this room right now tonight. You're relying on youth allowance, you're living on $40 a day, and you are actually having to choose whether or not it's going to be one packet of 2-minute noodles or two to get by. And we know that that is a fact. That is not an overblown claim about the reality. And I'm seeing all my great academic colleagues nodding their heads, because you know that that is the reality for far too many students in this country. And we have very serious concerns as ACOS. We represent a large body of community service organisations right across Australia, over 100 community organisations representing millions of people on very low incomes, that our interests, our needs, when it happens to you, and the social services that spend time working to provide support for people. So the facts are very clear. Our nation is facing persistent poverty, growing inequality, rising costs of housing, food and energy, increased demand for essential services, including disability, health and aged care, high levels of mental illness and domestic violence, the catastrophic threat of climate change, repeated extreme weather events, and the urgent need to transition to a clean economy. So these tax cuts could not come at a worse time. I think it is important for us to remember a little bit about how we got here and the history of these tax cuts. It's about politics. 3 stages of tax cuts were announced several years ago. It was in the heat of the intense turmoil of the then Turnbull and then Morrison-led coalition government. They were announced as policy by the coalition going into an election that they thought they were going to lose, actually. So it was not a bad political strategy from a distance. They could offer eye-watering tax cuts, a total of costing about $33 billion, after, mind you, having delivered several budgets where they were trying to raise revenue because actually they were trying to do government. But they thought they were going to lose. So did we. And because the opposition did not want to fight an election on tax, there was this signalling that they would support them. So they took it out of the election. So when the Morrison government was elected, we got a legislated set of package of taxes. It booby-trapped the budget. If the original plan, as we think, was the case from the Morrison government that promised these tax cuts, if it did get elected, was it was going to booby-trap a budget for a Labor government. And that is what we are now dealing with. And so again, in the politics of it, it is up to us to turn this situation around. And I think it is important also for us to recognise that those decisions, those political decisions that were made, were as a pandemic was unfolding. I painted a pretty bleak picture there for a bit about the state of the nation, but I also want to paint a picture of the nation that we can be when we really know what we need to do to come together and to look after each other. Now, the pandemic response was not perfect, but it did save lives, and we did come together, and we spent money when we needed to try and make sure that people kept a roof over their head, that they were in many cases supported to at least have a roof over their head for a period of time. And we effectively doubled the rate of income support, with the shocking reality of hundreds of thousands of people overnight who lost their jobs, and the snaking line of in front of Centrelink, and we all felt it. I think there was a genuine, deep concern in the community, and this was a government that never thought that it would spend billions of dollars overnight. It actually did, because it knew that politically it needed to move, and it needed to move really, really fast. Every day people lose their job. Right now, somebody is losing their job. So the snaking queue of Centrelink is real. It's just not all happening in one moment. We had free childcare, as you heard, and we also demonstrated that with the doubling of the income support payments, we reduced poverty virtually overnight on a scale that we had never seen before as a country. Of course, the great irony was that, as incredibly important as that was, and so many people who have had to rely on income support for longer periods of time talk about how profound that was to all of a sudden realise what it was like not to actually be in chronic distress and worry about whether or not you that day could afford one meal or two, or whether or not you could pay the energy bill, or whether or not in that moment you didn't have to worry about whether you'd be evicted and have to decide to sleep in a park because you couldn't actually finally make it all work together. For that 6-month period, that was not the chronic distress that you were dealing with. You were dealing with things like okay, how do I get a job? In fact, during that period, the participation rate was pretty solid. People actually were definitely out getting work. And as we've always said, having a more elevated rate of income support is actually one of the most important things we can do to place you in a great situation so that you can get the education you need, and then you can do all the things you need to be competitive in a labour market. We dramatically and overnight reduced poverty on a scale that we had never done before. And so the cruelness of what happened then cannot be overstated. And I have spent many times speaking with people who experienced what it was like to have more adequate income support and then lost it, to go back, to be plunged back in a policy, in a deliberate choice by government, back into abject poverty. So we've been advocating ongoing to lift up the rates of income support to something that is more respectable. Michelle from Hobart, she will talk, she's been a fantastic advocate with us. She talks about this. Right now, she is at the point where she has decided she can't afford the light globes anymore because they are quite expensive, and that's a couple of meals a day. And so she's rotating the light globes around her place where she lives. She talks about this freely and openly because she's had enough of living in silence about this experience. And she speaks about the fact that she's been told the medication she needs in order to stay well, she cannot afford them. And so she knows that she's been forced into this situation because of a lack of a few dollars, not a lot of dollars, but just a few dollars because she's making these chronic choices. So I wanted to paint that in a bit of all of its full reality, because this is about the unfairness of what we have currently bolted into our federal budget. Yes, they do all the sorts of things that are bad design on tax policy, you know, the flattening of the rates, you know, undermining the progressive nature of our income tax system, the impacts that has in terms of sort of equity. But I want to maybe just hone in on this statistic, which is if they go through, they will deliver, it's about $9,000 more for people who are earning $200,000 or more. So that works out to about $173 extra per week for the wealthiest people in Australia. At the same time, as we wake up every day to a debate about whether or not we can afford to lift finally the unemployment payment, which is just $50 a day. So these are the two sides of the deep moral and ethical debates that these sorts of tax cuts present us. This is about incomes policy. I think the distribution RAN, of course, and others have done a fair bit of sort of that analysis about the winners and the losers and who does particularly well. I do want to highlight, of course, the gender nature of these tax cuts. I think it's very, very important for us to see it. About 2/3 of the benefit of these tax cuts will go to higher income men. I'm often struck by that when I go into the decision-making rooms. I look around and see who's in those rooms. That's them. They are represented by those who get the most gain from these tax cuts. And it's very important to remember, Mark as well, a fantastic, community justice, tax justice advocate for a very long time, that actually any tax cut doesn't help about 30 or 40% of the lowest income people in the country at all, because they earn so little that they are completely outside of the tax system whatsoever. Of course, the distributional effects of this is also very important to look at, because this is in the end about politics and elections. So get the facts about the winners and losers around the country. Tasmania doesn't do very well at all. Anglicare Australia has done an excellent piece of work called Left Behind, which highlights the wealthy suburbs that get a lot of the money, and the parts in regional Australia, and South Australia is another one, doesn't do very well. So if you're engaged in politics, get a hold of that particular report as well. It's very, very important. Yes, Peter, there is a long list of the things we could do instead. Talked about submarines, talked about this. This is a lot of money, 243 billion over the decade. I just want to pause on that. I get told a lot, oh, we can't afford JobSeeker. Right? I want to be clear, if you were to increase job seeker to where we kind of at least think it should be, it would be less than half the costs of the tax cuts. If we were to, for example, fund what we need to keep on, we had a great meeting this morning with the Heart Foundation. They've got a campaign out at the moment trying to save in the budget the $11 million it would cost us to make available on the medical benefit system, the heart checks to prevent you from having a stroke or chronic illness. They're fighting to keep that in our public health system. $11 million, we say we can't afford it. Think how many of those little measures we could fund. And I'm just trying to think of which were the other ones to highlight. Maybe the social housing area. We could probably fund the increase of job seeker, what we need to fund public housing, and probably to double the rate of Commonwealth rent assistance if we forego the stage 3 tax cuts. That's an example. For 4% of the cost of these tax cuts, we could invest in energy performance improvements for low income renters, so that you're able to keep the lights on, you're able to cool the property, you get some insulation, and you might actually move off gas into electric energy supply and contribute to carbon emissions. And so there are many other things we could spend these dollars on. And so yes, it is about, we need more revenue. There are many big gaps in the social safety net and the services and the kind of, for example, in dental care. How many people do we know on low incomes who are still waiting to get their teeth fixed because they cannot afford to do it because dental is not part of the current Medicare system? So my list could go on, but I think the point is clear. Broader context for me is to remind us about who we are, because we often get a bit confused. We get a lot of narratives about who Australia is. You know, are we wealthy? Are we not? Are we high tax? Are we not? Well, it is very, very clear. The Credit Suisse does its annual wealth analysis globally. Peter, wealth really matters. It is actually what gives you that sense of safety when bad stuff happens. It's what you've got behind you, right? We are, on most measures, the wealthiest country in the world alongside Switzerland. So we are a country. So when the border closed, international border closed, and we all thought it was going to be terrible, the cash was just everywhere because the wealthiest people were just spending all their money here. They weren't going to Japan. They weren't going to, it was all in pumping through our local economy. And of course, now we're having a debate about inflation. And of course, we're being told actually it's the low income people who have to go without food and housing because that would be inflationary. That is not a credible argument, by the way, but you might hear that a bit. We are, so we're the wealthiest country in the world in terms of our overall wealth, but we are a very low spending country. We are the 6th lowest when it comes to our public expenditures on all of our social services, public health, etc. And we are also the 9th lowest when it comes to our overall tax base. So we are not a high taxing country. We are a relatively very low taxing country. So there is a reason why you can't get your kids into childcare and why you're having to wait on the list for public health and what, all of those sorts of things. You go, why is this happening? It's because we're not acting out of enough love to make sure we've got the resources to look after people and to have the things that we all should really be proud to be providing to our families, friends, and communities. Am I allowed to do one more thing, Peter? Okay. All right. So yes, it's about the revenue we need. Yes, there's a case about fairness. The last thing I just want to touch on is not just about getting rid of the stage 3 tax cuts. There's a few other things we should be doing with tax reform as well, because taxes are also what changes behaviour and in a big way. Now, if you care about climate change, you should care about tax. If you care about jobs, you should care about tax. If you care about housing affordability, you should care about tax, because it's by changing the tax rules, things like negative gearing and capital gains, things like putting a fairer tax on land rather than taxes that we can't capture. and being more efficient. Things like if we want to, in terms of behaviours, the way that so many people with a lot of wealth bundle their money into superannuation because it's the most tax effective thing. It's cheap, you get so many tax breaks, it's unbearable, really. And that's why there's trillions locked up in super. Well, think what we could do is say, actually, not as many tax breaks in there, people with a lot of money, put it into productive investment in the transition to the clean economy. So you actually provide the right signals about the behaviours of where wealth and investment should go, not into propping up property prices in a way that has made it really, really unaffordable for people who just want to have a safe place to live and call home. So I do love to talk about tax. That's quite obvious, but I'm very delighted to have been part of the discussion. And let's talk a little bit as a group. Thanks.
So I think everyone here loves to talk about tax. I think we all love to talk about tax. I hope you like to talk about tax as well, because I'd like to hear from you now. Do we have questions from any of you like, or maybe you want to disagree with all these people who say we shouldn't get these stage 3 tax cuts. Maybe you're itching for your stage 3 tax cut. You can't wait. I didn't think so. Yeah, please.
I mean, I guess tax cut. It's not a big tax problem. It's more of like a political problem. So I had a bit of fun about this. You basically just try going on the bribe. Something else is a good idea. What you do with something else, what would you do it to? Obviously, you don't need to charters like you have to get the politics of that policy. Yeah, what would you?
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly summarise the question, which is to say for the people online, this is not really a technical problem, it's a political question. It's a really, what would you do if you're saying this is $20 billion a year for the tax cuts? What would you do instead? Who wants to open the batting? We have a microphone here too, if you haven't got one.
Oh, me, I've got Cassandra, but yeah.
Well, I'm always happy to have another go.
I mean, health and education are the obvious ones. Housing is another one, but people's capacity to live a decent life is very much tied to their ability to access education, access a good public health, and have shelter. So that would be my priorities.
Can I follow up and feel free, Cassandra, because the political problem is also, I mean, if we went back to 2019, Cassandra, we could say Bill Shorten lost the election because of franking credits. A scare campaign about a tax that affected virtually no one. So actually it's also, how do you convince, how do you mount the political argument, I guess?
Yeah, look, I think because that's why my theme on this is actually it's up to us. This is a community debate which is so important for us to hold, so that we are educating ourselves about the choices, about the reality of who we are. What is the price of not developing more revenue. And we've all got our own take on what happened on that election, but the research is becoming clearer and clearer about it. That on things like the housing tax reforms, they were actually pretty well supported. And that's because many in the community had been talking about that and arguing that case and explaining why the capital gains discount was a problem in fueling the kind of investment we didn't need in the housing market. And we'd been involved in running a campaign about housing affordability. So it was creating this sort of political license, I guess, to change the rules on that front. But the franking credits came out of nowhere. And so those who wanted, including ourselves, frankly, there was not enough time to build the case, to build the understanding of why this was so important. I mean, Mark, you might have your own views about it, but I think it was essentially that. What the political scientists are showing is that there is this bit of a myth that we are selfish, that we vote only to gain for ourselves, and that is actually not what the best of the research shows. We want to understand it. We want to know that it's the right move. And then we will really back it for our children or for, you know, the community, you know, for example, on the impacts of disaster and extreme weather. We've got this move on climate now because people can see. They might have to give up some things, but it's right. So I do think in the strategies around tax reform, and you know, there's a lot of people have been involved in really good policy but can't get it there, is we have to explain, not it's about making more money, but it's about what are we going to do with it and what will it change in people's lives, the positive side of it rather than the tax policy itself, I think.
Miranda?
Yeah, just a couple of things about, this is one of those puzzles. You're answering a bunch of academics apart from Cass, and so we struggle with the political element of your question. One of the things that it's a couple of things to think about. One is that what I'm hearing from you is the sort of, how do we convince the middle classes actually, and perhaps the upper middle who are going to benefit from stage 3 tax cuts, that actually this isn't a good idea and that actually for the benefit. So of course we want to persuade the whole population, but we particularly want to be speaking to that middle class. So a few things to think about. I think one, the cost of education in this country has become very expensive for the middle classes. There's a very high expectation of private schooling. State schooling appears to be declining in quality, and there's a really uneven benefit of state schooling across the country in terms of quality and access. And childcare is also a part of that puzzle. And so all those public services that go to, you know, the population as a whole, including the middle classes, and are kind of part of the cohesion of society, we do not have enough revenue really to support those. On childcare, one of the things I say from time to time is that delivering universal free childcare is a tax cut, right? So that's actually a tax policy really. It reduces the cost of people going to work, and that's the middle classes really, sort of moderate to high in the middle there. And look, I think the third element is about, in the current context of stage 3 post-COVID, right, and post the COVID recession, is that we actually need more revenue. It's not that we need to stay within the same envelope. So the structural deficit is 2% of GDP, which is about 50 billion a year. Now, that might look a bit better in the current budget that's about to come out because commodity prices are high, and also because high inflation pushes up tax collections because of bracket creep, as we've been saying. So we're in a position where actually we don't have enough money. We have declining money. Our bucket is actually becoming emptier in terms of services. It's not that we're staying the same here. And we really need to find a way to come together to put a bit more money into the pot so that we can deliver that public good.
At some point, we're going to have to replace the revenue we get from coal and gas as well. Which anyway, I'm not. Yeah. So let me pose this question, which has come online, and basically the question is: if you were going to lop off one bit of the stage 3 tax cuts, which one would it be? Would you remove the change the lowering of the rate to 30%, removing the 37% rate, or the changing of the top threshold from 180 to 200,000? I think the Grattan one is to say they wouldn't change the 37% rate. Is that right? The Grattan had proposed. Yeah. So
the Grattan Institute have produced their budget repair report, which they release before the budget most years, I think. And they've sort of plumped for not removing the 37% rate. So the revenue would save by taking that piece and reversing it is around about 7 or 8 billion a year. So it's less than half of the total cost. Remember, I said most people are in that middle, so they're benefiting from the other things. But that's not nothing, right? So 7 or 8 billion a year is something we would like to have if one was to take that apart. I don't know if the others have different views.
Roger, do you have any?
I haven't thought about that at all. But that seems to strike me as the component that does most to reduce the progressivity of the tax system. So from that perspective, even if it's less than half, I'd probably be drawn to that.
Because those are the people who have, I suppose, the least need of a tax cut, you could argue as well, if you're going to have them through the system then. Any other questions from the floor? I've got another one from online. Put up your hand now or forever hold your peace. Okay. So how can we frame the narrative so that ordinary Australians better understand the implication of the stage 3 tax cuts? Frame in terms of how many job seeker years tax cuts are worth or something like that? The suggestion.
I think that's very much related to the first question, which is what are we forgoing by doing this? And if it's explicitly linked to something that the community wants, you know, sort of hypothecating the money, saying this is what we could buy and would buy if we didn't go through with this, is probably the strategy to make people explicitly cognizant of the trade-off that is being made. And
I think one thing that's maybe. I think another thing that's perhaps also important is to sort of make people more aware of sort of the flow-on impacts that things can have, like investing in education. And I think language is really important. So I think that for some of the policies in the past, people have used, or the policymakers have used term investment approach. I think that's actually really important to sort of say it's not just stopping with the paying sort of that additional funding right now. It will sort of actually reap rewards down the track. So if you sort of providing education to everyone, so that everyone has opportunities, then that next generation will be better placed to, I guess, support economic growth. And I think that's something that is often missing from the discussion. And I think with politics, it's often, just about that short term. And you should really think about a person's sort of, maybe 20 years down the track, because you sort of have a whole new generation growing up now, and you want to make sure that they get the best start. And I think if you do that, that will sort of reap rewards in 20 years' time. And you should think about that when you talk about investing in people and sort of putting sort of money where it's really needed, I think.
I wonder if there is a generational fight to be had, actually, that I'm amazed. I mean, at my generation, free tertiary education, buy a house when it wasn't a huge multiple of your income, and now I get all the benefits of low tax superannuation. Incredible. I would be furious if I was in my 20s.
I think people are really furious.
Yeah.
Who are living a different reality now and can very much see.
Yeah.
So I think, this is a debate that is being had. It's just not necessarily in the way that, the risk we have is if we don't provide these kinds of spaces to foster the discussion in a way that brings us together, there will be a high level of backlash and dissent for fair enough reasons, I think, in terms of the deep inequalities that people see now.
Catherine, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah.
We're nearly out of time, and I'm going to come to you very quickly, but yeah.
Yeah, I might just add that, that's part of what the Community Tax Project is trying to do. So I remember being in a room, a different tax setting, which is very much more the kind of suit type tax setting, where someone from one of the big accounting firms talked about the dead weight cost of just imposing a tax, which means that there's an additional economic tax cost to any tax because it changes people's behaviour from market-based principles. But if we think, well, that $1 of dead weight loss that they're referring to might fund the health tests or the heart tests that save someone's life. And I think it's about democratising and technicalising the tax debate to make sure that it's not just left at the dead weight loss argument, that we see what happens when we forego, when we make those choices in foregoing revenue.
Now we do need to wind up, but very quickly,
I just had a question. There's a component of this which is talking about not sort of cutting the tax rate on, say, the top 5 or top sort of 1%. But just out of interest, if you had the power to impose a tax rate on the top 1% comprehensively on all forms of income, there was a rate of 75% that Catherine said post kind of World War II. I'd just be interested, what would be the tax rate that you would impose on the top, say, 1%?
That's a great question. We'll finish with some blue sky dreaming. You can all give your preferred top marginal tax rate, let's say above 180,000, where the top rate cuts in at the moment. What would it be? Come on, put yourselves on the line.
I mean, to avoid scaring ourselves, I think there is a debate to be had about an additional high rate that really kicks in on high incomes, you know, possibly double the current threshold. And that's currently something we're not talking about. I'll avoid the question in that way.
And we're not talking about wealth taxes either, or inheritance taxes, or any of those things. I'll mention that as well. Look, we do have to wind up. So I'm going to hand over to Catherine to, I think you want to say a few words, Catherine, then also to introduce the Dean of the Law School, Professor Matthew Harding, to close proceedings. So Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Peter. I just want to say a few thank yous because, as many of you would know, it takes a lot of effort to run an event like this. So firstly, to Avril Gaylor for her amazing event organisation, and to Cheryl Coe, who's the project officer for the Community Tax Project. Thanks to the team at MSCI, so Joe, Claire, Charlene and Kathleen for their support of the Community Tax Project, and to the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law. Miranda, I note it's Miranda's birthday today, so what a gift of love to be here. That's right. That's right. I'd like to thank our community partners in the Community Tax Project. So the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, Oxfam, SACOS, Tax Justice Network, and also particularly ACOS, who have really got behind this project. So I'm so grateful to Cass for you coming to speak tonight. For any other representatives of community groups, please do get in touch. The more the merrier in terms of the Community Tax Project. Thanks to our wonderful speakers tonight who donated your time to be here. Guion, Roger, Miranda, Cass, it was such a great event. And also to Peter, who very kindly donated his time to so expertly MC this event. I'll now throw to Matthew, who will say a few words. Matthew Harding, who is our Dean of the Law School, who will say a few words to close the event. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine. Happy birthday, Miranda. I'll be brief. I wanted to say three things, really. One is what we've just heard tonight, I think, is academic work at its best. It's a group of scholars bringing perspectives from across disciplinary boundaries and engaging with civil society, and all within the framework of the Community Tax Project, which, for the reasons that Catherine's outlined, is just critically important as a vehicle and as a set of methods and practices in order to advance thinking and policy on these important questions about tax and the fairness and justice of our society. So I wanted to say that, and thank you all very much indeed for the contribution tonight and for the broader contribution that's being made through the Community Tax Project. The second thing I wanted to say was that, and this has come through so clearly in the presentations, the importance of these questions cannot be underestimated. I think Cassandra's point was well made. Tax is often viewed in policy and even in academic circles as something very technical, something highly specialised, something really to be left for the technocrats who know best. Well, nothing could be further from the truth, because in the end, what we're talking about are fundamental questions of morality and political order that every single one of us as citizens should be taking the keenest interest in. And so I just wanted to underscore that point, which came through so clearly in the different presentations. Nothing could be more important. The third point connected with that goes to something that Cassandra said towards the end here in the questioning. What is at stake here? It's not just questions of morality and justice, although that ought to be enough for anyone. But what's at stake really is the social stability that we prize and enjoy. Because if we don't get these questions right, the disenfranchised and the deprived and those who are left behind won't stand for it. And we know what happens. History teaches us many lessons about what happens when those voices are not heard and those concerns are not addressed. So nothing could be more important. Thank you for all the wonderful work. Happy birthday, Miranda, and good evening, everybody. Thanks very much.